Imagine an animal that can convert feed into meat with remarkable efficiency under the right conditions. It grows quickly. It reproduces frequently. It can be raised in relatively small spaces. That animal is the rabbit. On paper, the numbers are impressive. A female rabbit carries her young for only about a month. She can give birth to multiple offspring at once and under suitable conditions may become pregnant again soon afterward. Within a few months, the young can reach a size suitable for meat production. Compared with cattle, the contrast is clear. Cattle require a much longer reproductive and growth cycle, along with more land and resources. Rabbit meat is also lean and high in protein. For households with limited resources, rabbits could appear practical. During wartime and periods of meat shortage, rabbit production was promoted in both the United States and Britain. Households were encouraged to raise rabbits because they were compact and could be raised at household scale. For a time, rabbit keeping became a familiar part of food production. It was not treated as unusual. It was simply another way to produce meat. So why did that change? Why did rabbit largely disappear from American and British diets while chicken became one of the dominant meats? The answer is not biological. It is something more complex, because the animal that once looked like a practical source of food was about to occupy a different place in everyday life, and a devastating disease would help accelerate that shift. There was a time when eating rabbit in Britain and in parts of America wasn't unusual at all. During the Second World War, meat became harder to obtain and was heavily rationed in Britain. Beef and pork were tightly controlled. Families needed alternatives. Rabbit offered an obvious solution. It was small, it reproduced quickly, and it could be raised on a much smaller scale. In Britain, official policy encouraged domestic rabbit keeping as a way to supplement restricted meat supplies. Rabbit clubs spread across the country, turning a rural practice into a structured system of small-scale production. By 1942, official figures recorded around 116,000 breeding does among domestic rabbit club members. For many households, rabbit was not treated as an unusual substitute. It was simply part of the diet. People raised it, prepared it, ate it. For a time, it became a practical way to supplement Britain's limited meat supply. Then the war ended. Food supplies improved, diets began changing, and another animal was moving rapidly in the opposite direction: chicken. Modern poultry production was becoming increasingly efficient, standardized, and industrialized. Chicken fit the emerging food system unusually well. It could be bred in controlled conditions, processed at scale, and distributed through expanding commercial networks. Rabbit never achieved the same industrial momentum. Then, in 1953, a deadly disease began spreading through rabbit populations in Britain. It was called myxomatosis, and it would leave a lasting mark not only on rabbit populations, but on the place rabbits held in British life. Because once myxomatosis began spreading, it would become far more than a disease of rabbits. It would turn into a national controversy over farming, wildlife, food, and what humans should control. In 1953, myxomatosis began spreading rapidly through Britain's rabbit population. Its effects were severe and unmistakable. Infected rabbits developed extreme swelling around the head, eyes, and other soft tissues. Swelling around the eyes could leave them effectively blind, severely weakened, and eventually dying. The virus had already been deliberately introduced in Australia in the early 1950s to control invasive European rabbits, where it proved highly effective. Britain would later experience its own introduction of the virus. The consequences were devastating. Within a few years, Britain's wild rabbit population had fallen by roughly 99%. The impact was visible across the landscape. Fields and hedgerows that had once been filled with rabbits suddenly felt empty. For generations, rabbits had occupied a complex place in British life. They were hunted, they were farmed, they were eaten. They were also familiar animals encountered throughout the countryside. But now, that familiarity was replaced by something far more disturbing. The suffering caused by the disease also drew criticism from animal welfare advocates. The outbreak was widely reported, bringing the suffering of infected rabbits into public view. Against this changing background, the rabbit's image began to shift. It was increasingly associated not with food or farming, but with disease, weakness, and suffering. At the same time, rabbits were increasingly kept as companion animals. They were small, quiet, and well-suited to domestic environments. The animal was slowly changing categories in the public mind. It was no longer viewed only as livestock. It was becoming something people cared for. Because once an animal moves from the category of food into the category of companion, everything about how it is seen begins to change. And once rabbits were no longer just something on the table, but something in the home, a new cultural force began shaping how generations of children would imagine them through stories, illustrations, and the world of children's fiction. Rabbit had an efficiency advantage, but efficiency on a farm isn't the same thing as efficiency inside a factory, and this is where chicken pulled ahead. Modern poultry production proved unusually easy to standardize. Chickens are relatively small. They grow quickly. Large numbers can be raised under controlled conditions. Most importantly, they could be integrated into standardized standardized systems of breeding, growing, processing, and distribution. Once industrial meat production expanded, those characteristics became extremely valuable. A processing plant could handle enormous numbers of chickens through an organized sequence of operations. The system could be automated, workers could specialize, transport and packaging could be standardized, production could be coordinated from breeding through processing and marketing. This vertical coordination became a defining feature of modern poultry production. Rabbit, by contrast, remained far less integrated into large-scale systems. It was often produced in smaller units, with less coordination between breeding, processing, and distribution. That difference mattered more than raw reproductive efficiency. As modern food retailers and restaurants demanded huge, consistent supplies of inexpensive meat, producers needed animals that could move smoothly through an entire industrial pipeline. Chicken happened to fit that pipeline. Investment followed. Breeding programs improved. Processing facilities expanded. Distribution networks developed around poultry. Chicken increasingly became an everyday, affordable protein in America and Britain. An entire industrial infrastructure had developed around it. Once that system existed, it reinforced itself from genetics to retail shelves. In America and Britain, rabbit went in the opposite direction. It remained tied to smaller scale production, traditional cooking, and older food cultures. So rabbit lost on two fronts. People were becoming less comfortable seeing it as food, and the modern meat industry was becoming less interested in producing it. But outside America and Britain, rabbit remained an accepted food long after it faded from mainstream Western diets, and that contrast reveals just how local the rejection of rabbit really was. If rabbits became culturally unacceptable in America and Britain, it would be easy to assume the same happened everywhere. It didn't. In many parts of the world, rabbit remained an accepted food. Across Europe, from France and Italy to Spain and Portugal, rabbit has long been part of regional cuisines. Rabbit is also eaten in parts of Latin America. In Asia, China is a major producer and consumer of rabbit meat, where it remains part of food traditions. Nobody needs to convince these consumers that a rabbit can be dinner. It already is. That makes the American and British experience revealing. Its meat isn't universally rejected. The difference is largely cultural. Different societies develop different relationships with the same animal. In one place, it became traditional food. In another, a character in children's stories. In another, livestock. The animal hasn't changed. The meaning has. What people consider edible isn't determined by nutrition or agricultural efficiency alone. History, tradition, familiarity, and emotion can be just as powerful. In America and Britain, changing cultural attitudes helped push rabbit toward the companion animal category. Elsewhere, that shift never happened in the same way. So the real question isn't why humans don't eat rabbits. Humans clearly do. The more interesting question is why some societies stop. Once we understand that the barrier is largely cultural, a new possibility appears. If food categories can change once, they can change again. And that is exactly what some people are now trying to make happen today. The strange thing about rabbit's disappearance is that the argument for eating it never really went away. Rabbit is still relatively efficient to raise. It can require less space than large livestock. Its meat is lean and protein-rich. And in some systems, it can produce meat without the same resources required by larger livestock. So the question has returned. Could rabbit become a mainstream food again? From the 2000s onward, some chefs and food writers in America and Britain began revisiting rabbit. Restaurants started presenting it differently. Instead of treating it as old-fashioned wartime food, chefs positioned it as something more sophisticated, a sustainable alternative, a traditional ingredient, even a premium delicacy. But renewed interest largely remained within niche culinary circles. The problem wasn't really the meat, it was everything attached to the animal. For generations, Americans and Britons had come to associate rabbits with stories, cartoons, pets, and childhood. That association proved remarkably durable. Food choices often feel natural, permanent, almost biological, but they're deeply historical. The animals we eat are shaped by farming systems, economics, tradition, geography, and emotion. Chicken became an everyday food, partly because an enormous industrial system grew around it. Rabbit became unusual, partly because its cultural meaning moved elsewhere. Neither outcome was inevitable. The rabbit itself didn't become less efficient. What changed was the meaning attached to it. Rabbit may or may not return to mainstream Western diets. The question was never really, why don't we eat rabbits? Humans have eaten them for centuries. The more revealing question is, who taught us which animals belong on the plate? The answer is far more cultural and far less fixed than most of us realize.